My name is Wendy Perlman, and I direct the Middle East and North Africa Studies program here at Northwestern. So thank you for coming to our third installment of this series sharing fundamental knowledge about essential early history of Israel and Palestine. In our first lecture, Professor Awad Halabi painted a portrait of late Ottoman Palestine, emphasizing themes of religious coexistence. Last week, in our second installment, Professor Aryeh Dubnov discussed the origins and development of Zionism, arguing that it encompassed various and even sometimes conflicting streams of thought. Both speakers mentioned the transformative significance of World War I and European intervention in the region, which brings us to today's lecture. So the previous two lectures really set us up. If you were listening, you knew it would be critical to attend this one.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Nilel, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. Videos of all talks are on or will be available on the Buffett website. Unfortunately, our speaker for April 25th, Nadim Bawalsa, is no longer able to travel from Jordan due to the escalating uncertainty in the region. So we will now hold this talk on foundations of Palestinian nationalism over Zoom at 12:30 p.m. So we will distribute the link by email and let you know where you can access the link. Please spread the word and use the QR code on the back of the flyers or the printed survey to offer any feedback you wish. Now we will turn it over to Ipekus Malaum, Associate Professor at the History Department at Northwestern, who will introduce our third speaker and moderates today's talk. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yes, I'm presenting our speaker today, and as Mayan said, my name is İpek Koca Mariosmoğlu. I teach at the History Department here. I'm an Ottomanist by training as well, and I also direct the Kemal Modern Turkish Studies program at the Buffett Institute, and also serve on the faculty boards of MENA and the Crown Center. And it is it's a unique treat for me to be able to introduce Elizabeth Libby Thompson to you today, because she's not a great colleague. I admire her work, but she also has been someone that I really look up to as I was, going ahead in my career as a real role model, a very kind, encouraging role model. Libby has a extremely long publication record in English and French, so I'm not going to mention here everything, but of course I'll mention her three books, all of them award-winning books. The first one is called Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privilege and Gender in French Syria and Lebanon. This was published by Columbia University Press in 2000. And second, Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East, published by Harvard in 2013. And finally, her most recent, How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, the Syrian Congress of 1920 and the Destruction of its Historic Liberal Islamic Alliance. This was published by the Atlantic Monthly Press in 2020, and it has deservedly become, very influential and popular. So these three books, from the titles at least, you can see that there's a variety of themes here, and to put it very simply, very basically, they are about the history of gender, history of race, constitutionalism, liberal democracy, foreign interventionism, and international law, and of course how all these concepts relate to one another, their interdependency. And her geographic focus was the Levant and also the greater MENA region from the 1860s to the aftermath of World War I. But the common arc here, among these really varied subjects, is the impact of colonialism the impact of colonialism on social and political movements in the region, where people still grapple with its legacy, as you'll acknowledge. She challenges the commonly held notions and misperceptions about the history of representative government and public discourse in the Middle East, demonstrating that the colonial powers, called the great powers back then, far from introducing to the Levant concepts such as liberal constitutionalism, actually thwarted their flourishing and contributed to or even created many of the conflicts that inflame the region even to this day. Libby's next book project, I have heard just a little bit about it. It is, under progress. It has a much, much broader reach, and it is tentatively titled, How the 1919 Paris Peace Conference Sparked Racist Counter-Revolution Around the World. And we can't wait to read that one. Today, she's going to be telling us about the origins of the Palestine Mandate. So please join me welcoming Libby Thompson.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Ipek. Ipek and I met over a decade ago in National Endowment for Humanities, a summer seminar for faculty on World War I in the Middle East and North Africa. We succeeded, I have to say, thanks to NEH, thanks to the government. Sometimes government funding is so important to establish World War I as a subfield within Middle Eastern history, which had not existed before. It pertains to my talk today because I have come to believe, after 25 years of working around that war and its political impact in the region, to believe that World War I was as influential and as devastating to the Middle East as the American Civil War was to American political history. To this day, decades later, the ramifications from that violent conflict continue to shape and inform political debate and events right now. And so I'm going to jump into that by focusing in on the theme of your series here at Northwestern, the Palestine Mandate. As in the United States, the violence of the World War I became institutionalized in the politics of the Middle East. Losers did not accept their defeat. Winners exploited their gains, and the anger and agony of war reverberated through the region in the century since. Decisions made by powerful men and the massive suffering of civilians between the years 1914 and 1923 lie at the deepest roots of the violence we still witness 100 years later. Civil war, as we've seen in the last decade, destroyed Syria and has left half of its population refugees. The current war in Israel-Palestine has flattened Gaza and ignited the West Bank. As we speak this evening, famine again threatens the region as it did in World War I, and war threatens to spread across the region. Briefly, I dedicate this talk to the children of both Israel and Palestine. 100 years ago, Eglantine Jeb petitioned the new League of Nations with a Declaration of the Rights of the Child. Why? Because she was appalled to learn at the closing of World War I that the Allied blockades were responsible for the hunger, starvation, and even deaths of children in Europe and the Middle East. The declaration adopted by the League was to ensure that children, innocent children, would not suffer the devastations of war, and that aid would be available to them no matter what country they lived in. If you know the story of Jeb, you know she stood in the middle of Trafalgar Square as the peace conference was going on in 1919 with pictures of starving German children. The blockade continued after the armistice of November 1918 and was not lifted until the Germans signed the Versailles Treaty in June 1919. She did not know the degree of devastation in the Middle East, however, and that, unfortunately, I have to share with you, because Back then, as now, children have been the innocent victims of a cynical politics of violence waged by their parents and their grandparents. Today, as you know, Israeli children suffer. They witnessed the death of 200 or more at the Nova Music Festival, while Palestinian children die under bombs daily, and survivors scrabble to eat grass and animal feed. I did not think I would ever see a war as bad or worse as World War I in the region. I was wrong. I'll divide my talk into three parts, three levels of violence. They will come together, I promise you, by part three. Part one is about war. It is about the violence waged by Ottoman and British generals. Part two is about the violence of peacemaking, right? Made by politicians who gathered at Paris for the peace conference, who destroyed, actively, consciously destroyed, Arabs' efforts to build themselves a democratic constitutional government. And here I'm talking about Greater Syria, which included Palestine. I draw this, as Ipek noted to you, from my last book on the destruction of democracy. The third part is about the violence of the Palestine Mandate itself, fueled first by the desperate peoples who had suffered in World War I and who feared their annihilation, just as they had seen the Armenians annihilated during that war. That violence was institutionalized, I will argue, by British statesmen. Although we tend to talk about Arab-Israeli peace conflict as a two-sided conflict between ideologically driven sides, I'd like to suggest, by the time we get to the end of part three of my talk, that the key to turning fear into routinized violence lay in the asymmetrical political regime instituted by the British under the Palestine Mandate, by institutionalizing a radical difference in political access and power between Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. They guaranteed that politics would turn violent then until now. I will draw on the work in part three of a historical sociologist I have long admired, Charles Tilly, who theorized based on a massive survey of state formation and war across the world and across the centuries, to suggest that what we're seeing in Israel-Palestine today is not as exceptional as, say, Orientalists would have you believe, because the cultures themselves are violent, not exceptional because of the Middle East and its peculiarities, but an extreme example of a kind of violent structuring of politics that was present in state formation across the globe, unfortunately. Historians, unlike the political scientists, don't have to make policy prescriptions, but I will make some suggestions at the end of the talk. So let's start with part one, war. And particularly want to point out here that, yes, there is collective fear at work, all right, on both sides, all right, on the part of both Jews and Arabs. What will those who wage the war do with it is our question. On October 27th, 1917, the British launched their final attack on Gaza. British guns had already laid waste to Gaza City, that was once home to 40,000 people in the earlier battles of 1917. The British had also deployed the first use of poison gas in the Middle East during World War I. But Ottoman and Austrian troops stood fast. As you may know from World War I, the British and the French and the Russians were on the side of the Allied or Entente powers. The Ottomans, the Austrians, and the Germans were on the side of the Central Powers. Here we had some German commanders, but mostly Ottoman and Austrian troops positioned in Palestine. They stood fast and forced the British to retreat at sunset, thirsty and exhausted. For fear of another assault, the Ottomans evacuated Gaza in early 1917. This time in October, General Edmund Allenby left nothing to chance. Egyptian laborers, they are a topic in my new book. I'm looking at the 4 million men of color recruited into the Allied armies who were subjected to basically forced labor. Egyptian laborers in his army spent months laying railroad tracks and water pipes from the Sinai Peninsula up to the Gaza border. The British controlled Sinai and Egypt. They had occupied Egypt in 1882. They were protecting the vital Suez Canal, their link to India. By October, Allenby had also gathered 80,000 troops at the Gaza border, twice the number that the Ottoman side had. The October attack was the heaviest bombardment of World War I outside of Europe. Artillery guns blasted first, then guns from British and French warships. Finally, British warplanes dropped bombs on Gaza City the night of November 1st. I'm dwelling on these details because they resonate so much with what we have seen unfold in the past 6 months. More artillery shells blasted Gaza City than on the first day of the infamous Battle of the Somme on the Western Front in France. While the Ottomans defended Gaza City, Allenby planned a sneak attack. Won't go into these details too much, but you know that he slipped around and attacked Beersheba, broke the Ottoman defense lines, and then gained the advantage. By November 7th, 10 days after the first attack, British forces entered Gaza City. Not a single house was left standing. Days later, the British raced up the coast and captured Jaffa. A month later, on December 9th, they captured Jerusalem. The mayor of the city welcomed the British as saviors because the British brought food. The Allied powers of World War I used food as a routine weapon of war. They blockaded both the German and Ottoman coasts. In 1916, even though they had learned that people in the region were already starving, in fact, there was a report that 80,000 people were dead in Mount Lebanon, just north of Palestine, they had refused to lift the blockade. They wrongly hoped that hunger would force the Ottomans to surrender. Inside the empire, the Ottomans bled Greater Syria white. Greater Syria refers to the current states of Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. It is an area that, after the war, had just 3 million people in it, a very small area. But during that same war, the British and the French planned to split that territory between themselves into pretty unviable small statelets, in a race to gain imperial rewards in a war that had been so devastating and costly over in Europe. The Ottomans, a non-industrialized state, had surprised the Allies in staying in the war so long. But to do so, they had had to strip farmers of all their livestock, burn down forests that once existed in Syria, confiscate their farm tools, and recruit men who might have been used to bring in a harvest to a population starved of food by the Allied blockade. On December 11th, General Allenby marched into Jerusalem. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George presented that victory as a Christmas gift to the British people after a terrible year of war in Europe. And remember, the battles of Verdun and the Somme had killed millions of men for no good reason, right? There was no territorial gain. Allenby, the general, wrote, "Our reception was cordial everywhere, and from the Christians, enthusiastic. The crowd outside the Holy Sepulchre cried, 'Vive les Anglais,' he wrote to the king. 'Vive le roi King George.' In public, Allenby promised equal treatment of all religious groups and protection of their holy places in Jerusalem. He also hinted that self-determination promised by Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points would soon come their way. However, in private, Allenby invoked the Crusades. The British had broken 400 years of Ottoman rule and more than 700 years of Muslim rule in the Holy Land. To his wife, Allenby described his march to Jerusalem as following the very same path that Richard Lionheart had followed in his battle against Saladin. To his superiors in London, Allenby wrote that the conquest of Jerusalem was a great victory for the empire. Very briefly, the conquest of Greater Syria was completed over the next 10 months, paused because of a huge German invasion in Europe in the spring of 1919, and Allenby lost many troops to be sent up to the French front. The forces of the Arab Revolt, I'll talk about them more in a moment, made famous by the movie Lawrence of Arabia, battled on the east side of the Jordan River, here it is, blowing up railroad tracks to isolate the Ottomans. Along the coast moved Allenby's infantry. The two movements met at the ancient Syrian capital of Damascus on October 1st, 1918. They ousted the last Ottoman troops from all of Syria by the end of the month, reaching Aleppo on October 26th, 2 weeks before the final armistice ended World War I on November 11th. Whoop. Getting ahead of ourselves there. There we go. Faisal paraded with his northern Arab army to cheering crowds in Damascus. He proclaimed a new era of constitutional government to replace the brutal wartime dictatorship of the Ottomans. The new Syrian government, he promised, would care for all Syrians regardless of religion. However, Faisal's government encountered a population much hungrier and more desperate than Allenby had found in Jerusalem. The Allied blockade and poor harvests had caused famine that are estimated to have killed as many as 500,000 people in Greater Syria. That's nearly 1 in 6 people. All right. This represented the worst suffering of civilians so far in the 4-year war. They also encountered Armenian refugees. Refugees of the genocide had appeared in Syria, escaping or pushed by the Turks in mid-1915 and continued to arrive into 1916. Survivors, mostly women and children, were destitute. These children were put in an orphanage in Jerusalem. The highest concentration of them were in Aleppo and in the Valley of Lebanon. At the very same time, in the same war, and again, this is a caution against thinking of, oh, no, we don't want you yet, we want this. A caution against thinking of the Middle Eastern history as a separate category, but rather seeing it as part of a larger war. One of the other things I'm very proud about, or happy about in the study of World War I is that it is finally being studied and published about as a truly global war, not a European war. Up until 25 years ago, most books would focus mainly on the Western Front in France, and now we're appreciating and capturing the experiences of peoples not only in the Middle East, but also in Eastern Europe. All right. At the very same time, Jews of Eastern Europe were suffering forced migration, hunger, and atrocities on the Russian front. During the Russian Civil War in 1918 and 1921, an estimated 100,000 Jews were killed in pogroms in Ukraine and Poland. Hundreds of Jewish communities were burned down. Historians call these pogroms a prelude to the Holocaust of World War II. Zionist leaders from Eastern Europe rushed to Palestine, seeking refuge for their people. Why did they rush there? Because on November 2nd, 1917, the very day that bombardment, equaling the bombardment of the Somme at Gaza, was raining down on the people in southern Palestine, Lord Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, had issued his declaration. It, as you can read here, promised Jews, His Majesty's government view with the favor with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I will come back to some of this language, that's why I read it, but I just want to make two comments here. Up until the Russian Revolution, which is occurring at about the very same time, like November 1917, and before the Balfour Declaration, David Ben-Gurion, who had a founder of the modern state of Israel, had been expelled by the Ottomans from Palestine. The governor, Jamal Pasha, had called him in and said, "I heard you're planning to establish a state here." And said, "Yes, we'd like to establish a state for the Jews here." "That's treason. This is Ottoman territory. You're out of here." Okay? So many Jews were expelled by Jamal Pasha during the war. Ben-Gurion took the opportunity to go to the United States and tour the United States, trying to recruit people to a Jewish brigade. He got very few recruits. Back in New York, they heard the news of the Russian Revolution, and half of the people he knew, this is according to letters, I read through his letters to his wife, said, "Well, no, maybe we should go back to Russia and finish the revolution there." But all of a sudden, with a guarantee of British protection, rather than the uncertain circumstances of Ottoman Palestine, those Jews in Eastern Europe saw a place where they might find safety. Okay. Between 1919 and 1920, just right after the war, in those 2 years, 10,000 Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe would immigrate to Palestine, a Palestine unprepared even to meet the needs of its destitute Arab population. As the Russian Civil War continued, another 25,000 would arrive in the next 3 years. What to do? Chaim Weizmann, the British Zionist leader and friend of Balfour, arrived in early 1918 with a Zionist commission to begin building their promised Jewish homeland. Arab politicians like Jerusalem Mayor Musa Kazem Pasha also feared for the annihilation of his own people, just as Chaim Weizmann feared the annihilation of the Jewish people. We're talking about two collective movements embodying an existential fear that they will be wiped off the map. They'd seen it with their own eyes. All right, Ben-Gurion was in Palestine when the Armenians arrived. All right, intimations that there are powers up there who are identifying you, an individual, as part of a group that does not deserve to exist. Right, enters the consciousness of first political leaders and then the people they follow, the people who look up to them to save them. When food had run short and Armenian refugees had appeared in 1915 in Palestine, Arabs mistakenly believed that the Ottomans were intending to annihilate them too. Now, in 1918, they had heard about the Balfour Declaration, as well as secret French and British plans to partition Syria, and so they too feared that they would be wiped off the map. The British generals who had conquered Syria began exchanging notes, agreeing that the British and French partition plans, infamously known as the Sykes-Picot Accords, must be torn up. Okay? They feared that news of the secret deals would provoke revolt, even in Egypt. Arab leaders, like their Zionist counterparts, sought to help themselves. They embraced Wilson's 12th point of the famous 14 points, promising autonomy and self-government to the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. They believed that constitutional government, and again, this draws on my past work, as you know from my intellectual biography, against the Turkish wartime dictatorship would restore prosperity and peace to their peoples. But the European statesmen now gathering to open the Paris Peace Conference in January 1919 had other plans. They sought to build on their Christmas present of conquest in order to expand their empire. So we go to part two, moving from the violence of generals to the violence of politicians, and particularly from the violence that created just a fear that my children will even live, to the violence of excluding people from the realm of the very system of international law that Woodrow Wilson had promised the world he would build at the Paris Peace Conference, right? Wilson was famous for saying we must reorganize international relations, build a League of Nations, build world courts, and hold people to the law, provide opportunities to negotiate over conflicts without rushing to weapons, as was done in 1914. And so the Arabs had reasonable expectation that they too would enjoy protection and rights under international law to the same self-determination that Wilson had promised. As the guns fell silent in 1918, the grieving continued. Never again, people vowed. We must change our political system to protect our people, not kill them. Again, I'm drawing parallels just because we are Americans. There could be other parallels drawn, but I'm struck, and in the Q&A I'll tell you why. It's part of the New Book Project, actually. But I see remarkable parallels in the spirit of 1919 to the spirit of 1865, when the United States embarked on Reconstruction as a way of rebuilding the country on a new basis to remedy the gross inequalities, to restore a people of the government by the people and of the people and for the people, as Lincoln had promised. It's remarkable. Not only W.E. Du Bois in the United States, but French people began using the word reconstruction. Right? And there was this sense that wars may be devastating, but they may also offer opportunities for change, for revolution, if you will, but not, heaven forbid, a Bolshevik revolution. Right? The Arabs caught this spirit. In fact, in my last book, I noted that some of the followers of Prince Faisal, the leader of the Arab army, had read Wilson's political science textbook. He wrote one of the first political science textbooks out there in the 1890s called The State, right? And they'd actually read, no surprise, Wilson praised the federal system in the United States as a particularly admirable form. And that's what they imagined. They wanted to build an Arab federation where Arabia, Syria, and Iraq would be the federated states, the United States of Arabia, if you will. Okay. And this was in part built on promises that the British had made to Prince Faisal's father in 1915, that if the Arabs raised a revolt and helped defeat the Ottomans, they would get their own independent state. Okay. Some of you are familiar with the sort of many cross-cutting and contradictory promises made by the British in World War I. Others are not. I hope I'm covering a sort of middle ground between those who are and who don't. The Syrian Arab Kingdom, established by Faisal and a Syrian Congress, grew from Faisal's army service and its ties to the Syrian nationalist movement before and during the war. It was not a movement, as colonizers would later claim, of Sharifian Arabs from Mecca and Medina. By the time Faisal's army approached Damascus, it was filled with people from Syria. Okay? And it was working on intelligence from Arab nationalists, Syrian Arab nationalists, still living behind Ottoman lines in Damascus. Okay. The government he proclaimed in October 1918 would represent Greater Syria then, this distinct region I've circled here. It had been governed under one general during World War I, Jamal Pasha. 95% of its 3.2 million residents spoke Arabic of a similar dialect, distinct from Iraq, Arabia, or Egypt. 3/5 of its population were Sunni Muslims. 1/5 were Christians. 1/5, mostly other Muslim sects. 5% of the population was Jewish. Some of them, long-standing Jews of the East, living in cities like Aleppo, and especially Jerusalem. Others, recent immigrants. On October 5th, 1918, 2 days after his triumphant entry into Damascus, Faisal proclaimed this constitutional state as a state in the making, awaiting the stamp of approval from Paris. There we go. He personally traveled to Paris, where he impressed Woodrow Wilson. The United States president defended Syrians' rights to self-determination against British and French claims to their rights under their secret Sykes-Picot Treaty. If you recall, throughout the year 1918, Wilson condemned the practice of signing secret treaties, right, and had promised in the 14 points a new era of diplomacy based on transparency. And he repeatedly, you can read the transcripts of his discussions with the British and French in the early months of 1919, repeatedly disregarded any secret agreements as illegitimate, right? He was furious that the French and British still continued to talk as though they owned zones of influence in Syria, where Wilson actually had friends. The president of the American University in Beirut, called the Syrian Protestant College at that time, was a friend of his. Prominent missionaries and philanthropists in the United States, who also contributed to his election campaign, had also organized large philanthropic campaigns to collect money for Armenians and Syrians who were starving in the war. And so he tapped those contacts, and he organized an American commission of inquiry to go poll Syrians on what kind of government they would like, because he had promised in Article 5 that there would be limits to colonial ambitions in the New World Order and that people would be governed by their consent. In the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more. For this project, I had to wade through the very thick, nasty, conflictual literature on Woodrow Wilson and his plans. But the upshot is that the latest and fairly compelling analyses of his political thinking at this time uphold him as a realist, not an idealist, and as someone who well understood the reasons why the world fell into world war. And it had much to do with the same reasons that Lenin gave, that in 1914 imperialists had come at loggerheads. Okay. Anyway, Faisal was overjoyed at the news that an American commissioner would come and poll his people. So he ran home and organized elections for a representative Congress to meet Wilson's commission that summer. I'm having trouble. My element of surprise has been lost. I'm sorry. Let me go back. For some reason, I'm having trouble. There it is. This is an important document. I should say, spoiler alert, the French will destroy this government, right? And they will order the confiscation of all traces of it. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. And so collecting documents belonging to it is an arduous task, okay? One of my main sources has been this poster. You can find these in many different countries of the period where their leaders are, usually it's in, ovals, portrait ovals, right? But anyway, there's Faisal at the top. I'm going to talk about Rashid Rida with the blue star in a minute, okay? You can see men with turbans who are men of religion. You can see men wearing tarbushes or fezzes. Those were generally lawyers, professionals, people who'd worked in the government. This Congress was full of people who had been either representatives in the parliament in Istanbul in Ottoman days, or governors of districts or entire provinces during those days. There were also these men, tribal leaders, because Arabs felt that they had earned the right to a sovereign government by fighting the war, which is a claim that Czechs made in Europe, as well as Poles, as well as Serbs and other peoples who were living in that other empire dismantled in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay? Included amongst the men here, and I was able to get, there are about 87 of them. The numbers fluctuated, but I was able to identify at least 80 of them. There are maybe a dozen men from Palestine, what we call Palestine today. Another 20 from what we would call Lebanon today. Hardcore from what we would call Syria today. A scattering from what's Jordan, and some actually from Alexandretta, the parts of what is Turkey today, okay? They all considered themselves Syrians, right? And there's a nice book written by a former Princeton historian on, a fact book, on how much by the early 20th century, Greater Syria had become a sort of self-conscious community unto itself, all right? Long story short, they declared to Wilson's commission that they would prefer to have an independent state, not a mandate. All right, mandates were these things that the French and British wanted that would be temporary periods of supervision, if you will, or they use the word tutelage, for people not yet ready to govern themselves. These people reasoned, I'm sorry, we've been governing ourselves in the Ottoman era. Back in 1908, we had a constitutional revolution, and the Ottoman Sultan spoke at our parliament and said, oh, okay, I canceled your constitution 30 years ago, in 1878, but now, oh, he was very condescending, now I think you're mature enough to govern yourselves. So they said, it's now 1919. Why are we all of a sudden not capable of governing ourselves? We are much like the Czechs, much like the Poles, you know, organizing our own state out of a foreign empire. Yeah, we have some problems. Yeah, we still use Egyptian money. The Poles were using money from the Austro-Hungarian and other countries, right, at this time, right? So we want independence. But if Paris insists on a mandate, it must not be a colony. We'll take an American mandate. Our preference is for Americans to supervise us for a brief period of time using advisors that we choose. Nobody forced it on. No occupying army, no colonial governor. Okay? In all cases, the Congress refused a French mandate because they knew France intended to rule Syria like a colony. This is all very well and good to choose the Americans, but as you all may know, back in Washington, D.C., the United States Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty and rejected membership in the League of Nations. Abandoned by the Americans in late 1919, the Syrian Congress feared the worst from Britain and France. In March 1920, it declared independence, the independence of Syria, on the basis of Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, which came into legal force in January of 1920. Article 22 said that they belonged to a Type A mandate, meaning that Syrians would be granted provisional independence, subject to some advice and tutelage, right? And that they would choose their mandatory power, their advisors, themselves. This was not going to happen, as you can gather. All right? But according to Article 22, they were provisionally independent, and they wrote a long Declaration of Independence defending that position. There are a good number of lawyers in this government who were trained at the Sorbonne. That was a favorite place to send your sons in Syria. All right, a note, because of course I'm not forgetting about Palestine, and time's a ticking, so I'm going to move faster. The declaration claimed independence for all of Greater Syria. Now this angered the French, who are already occupying the Lebanese coast, and the British, who were in Palestine. Okay. Indeed, a dozen deputies, as I mentioned, from Palestine were present. The Congress secretary was a man named Izzat Darwazeh, who came from Nablus, for example. The declaration did not recognize a separate Jewish homeland in Palestine. Rather, it invited Jews to live in Syria as equal citizens. The Zionists, however, shunned the Syrian Arab Kingdom and did not send any deputies to Damascus. Now, immediately after declaring their independence, the Congress got busy drafting a constitution. They wanted to demonstrate their ability to govern themselves as a modern democracy to Paris. All right, and here we go. They gathered in this building, in the central square of Damascus. It's still there, okay? And they met between March and July of 1920 and produced what I would call a true political contract between the representatives of people, and again, just for purposes that we're Americans, not that this is the perfect analogy, but this is not really qualitatively unlike what a bunch of Americans did in Philadelphia in 1787. Okay? In fact, it was a little bit more transparent because they allowed the press to report on their debates, whereas the American Constitution was deliberated and written in complete secrecy. I draw on scholars like political scientist Nathan Brown at George Washington University, who have written that such bottom-up constitutions actually have durability, in contrast to the kind of constitutions that lately we've tried to impose on people, written by technocrats, without any passionate bargaining that would bind people together. I would argue that Syrians bound themselves together in writing their constitution. Very briefly, all I want to say, I'm going to skip over some stuff, but we can talk about it in the Q&A. I have argued that this was the most democratic constitution in the Arab world to date, including anything existing today. All right? It gave the preponderance of power to the parliament, not the king. Okay? The king could not dismiss the parliament, and the prime minister was responsible to parliament, not the king, for example. But most of all, in Article 1, it established that the Arab Kingdom of Syria is a civil representative monarchy. Its capital is Damascus, and the religion of its king is Islam. I want to pause there because if you hadn't spent the months I had poring over this stuff, you wouldn't understand the importance of that line. Nowhere in this Constitution is Islamic law cited as the source of legislation, unlike almost every Arab constitution today. Okay, my last book was about how is this, why would this be the case? Why is there no Islam as an official religion? All right, Islam was the official religion of the Ottoman Empire. It was the official religion of Turkey until a few years later when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk would abolish that as an official religion. But the Syrians did it first, and nobody knew that until I published my book in the English-speaking world. Okay, why? Because the French, after destroying all the copies they could find of this constitution, published a French translation saying, and the religion of its state is Islam. Now, why would the French do that? Because the French wanted to portray the Syrians as fanatical Muslims who would kill Christians the way the Ottomans had killed Armenians. That's how they justified their occupation of Syria, and that lie has lived on. Okay? In fact, in the 1950s, in a journal called, Middle East, Middle East Studies? Middle East Studies? Is that the one out of Washington, the Middle East Institute? Yeah. An Iraqi policymaker, it's the beginning of World War II, and America becomes involved in the Middle East and all that, actually wrote an article saying, Syria has always had Islam as the basis of its state and law, just like now, because Syria had a new constitution in the early 1950s, right? He was using the French translation, and he didn't do his homework. And so, the lie was spread. That's how lies get spread. Why am I deliberating on this? Because the offer to include Christians and Jews in this state as equal citizens was real. All right, the man who was president of the Congress, I don't know why my things are sticky today. Wasn't this man, I pointed him out on the Congress poster, Rashid Rida. He published probably the most popular Islamic magazine of the day. It was called Al-Manar, or The Lighthouse. Read from Morocco to Indonesia. I ran into a historian who found copies of that magazine, published from 1898 until 1935, even in Indonesia. Okay? He was a highly trained religious scholar, living in exile in Cairo because he was promoting constitutionalism and equality in the Ottoman Empire, and the Sultan didn't like that. But he was originally from a town right outside of Tripoli, Lebanon. He considered himself a Syrian, okay? And this man came to Syria in 1919 to join the Congress and to advise Faisal, okay? He had seen up close the tactics of British colonialism in Egypt, and he wanted to warn them what dangers lay ahead. But most important, Rashid Rida, even though he believed that progress in the Middle East belonged to reforming Islam and not to secularism, signed off on a constitution that disestablished Islam. How? How could that be? Because he believed Islam was essentially democratic. Okay. And he believed that if you based a law in the state on Islam, the non-Muslims, his neighbors, remember he grew up in Lebanon with a lot of Christians and some Jews, right? Then that's fundamentally unequal, right? They would not. And so he, a man of religion, it probably couldn't have happened if he were not the president of that Congress. You needed someone with that kind of authority to tell the religious conservatives in the Congress, it's okay. It's okay. I know that the people of Syria are kind of used to having a sort of religious leader as their, king. I mean, the Sultan was also a caliph, right? We'll leave him as the religious leader. Maybe we're not ready for a secular republic yet, right? But we're restricting that Islamicness of the state to the person of the king. He wrote extensively about the idea that there's Islamic law and then there's something called the public interest. In Arabic, it's called a maslaha al-amma. And there is a boundary to the jurisdiction of Islamic law that does not hold. One of the things that happens when this region gets colonized after World War I is that Islamic movements emerge in reaction to the phony liberalism of Europe, the phony promises that have been made that they would have their own state. And they said, we'll never get justice from Europe. Let's find justice in our own religion. All right? And in reaction, the presence of Rashid Rida in 1920 at a constitutional Congress that actually disestablished Islam in favor of equality was forgotten. Okay? We get ahead of ourselves. All right? It is a small point, but I think an important point, that this was also possible because they all faced a common enemy in the British and French. And so religious conservatives and secular liberals got together in Damascus and signed off on that constitution. Okay, I'm really going to go fast because I see it's getting kind of late. Okay, so even as they signed off on the Constitution, however, Europeans got together, the Supreme Council of the Peace Conference, and decided to split up poor little Greater Syria with nearly 3 million people into the states of eventually Palestine and Transjordan. Initially, Palestine and Transjordan were together under the British, and then northern Syria, Lebanon and Syria, under the French in blue. All right? Remember, that's 3 million people. We're cutting it into 4 pieces. All right? There were 13 million people living in Anatolia, what is called Turkey, a little bit on this map. There were another 13 million people living in Egypt. This is not many people to be splitting up into 4. The Palestine Mandate would have fewer than 1 million people in it when we get to it. Okay? Quickly, there's the French Prime Minister signing off on the order to destroy Faisal and his government, calling Democrats extremists. The French army gathers, and in July of 1920, they occupy the city of Damascus and destroy whatever they can left of that government. Let's get to part 3, the Palestine Mandate, the reason you all are here today. So this is all build up to that, okay? As I mentioned, the Palestine Mandate was very small. It originally was included what is now Jordan, but it is just the sort of yellow-orange portion, a little smaller than the state of New Jersey. 89% Arab, including Muslims and Christians, 11% Jewish, according to the 1922 census. Okay? Most Arabs were poor villagers, peasants, or recent urban migrants eking out some kind of life after the devastation of war. The Jewish population had actually rebounded to 84,000 people by 1922 with the help of the Zionist organization, which helped them come from Europe. Some settled in the countryside, others mostly in cities. Tel Aviv expanded as a Jewish city next to Arab Jaffa. All right, skipping over a few details. Thanks to investment from outside, thanks to the extraordinary organizing capacity of people who had organized against pogroms and in socialist parties and Zionist parties back in Europe, the Yishuv, or Jewish community in Palestine, became highly organized and a virtual government within the mandate. And one of the leading figures in that effort was David Ben-Gurion, who headed up a vast labor federation. So if you were an immigrant, you came to Jaffa, you got off the boat, right? Here was an organization that would find you a job, find you a home, and get a school for your kids, okay? Meanwhile, however, talk about inequities breeding violence, the Arabs received nothing, right? The British budget was busted after World War I. They had very little to invest in Palestine, and tensions grew as the immigrants arrived. The promise of British protection did not, however, erase the fear of annihilation. Even as the Russian Civil War ended, Zionists in Palestine were extremely sensitive to the fact that they were a tiny minority and they were not welcomed. Amongst those who came was Zev Jabotinsky, who came from Odessa, the heart of Ukraine, where the pogroms had occurred, and he personally had fought pogroms there. He was determined to build a militant movement to clear territory for a Jewish state. His organizations, including the Irgun, were the ancestors, if you will, of the Likud party governing Israel today. These I'm going to drive very quickly to my theories from Charles Tilley on the institutionalization of violence in asymmetric regimes. So I want you to sort of pay attention here. Paramilitary groups like his institutionalize in a collective form the fear, the existential fears that people felt coming out of World War I. Okay. Same process, a little slower, occurred on the Arab side. Here is, you can see him up talking to Winston Churchill, is Musa Kazem Pasha, the mayor of Jerusalem. He and other Arabs at first built Muslim-Christian associations across Palestine, staged boycotts, sent delegations to London, tried to hold the British to the League of Nations Covenant Article 22, and to conventions of liberal principles and so on. Let's just say, long story short, as violence grew in the 1920s and as delegations like this one failed to obtain any change in the basic rules of the Palestine Mandate, they were discredited. And as it appeared that Jews were gaining much more wealth and the Arabs were growing much more angry at their relative deprivation, their own paramilitary organizations emerged. This is Izzadin Qassam, an imam in Haifa, in the north of Palestine. He began organizing sort of welfare and education programs, but soon he organized defensive brigades. In a shootout with the British in 1934, he was killed. But he became a legend, a martyr for the cause, inspiring a general strike in 1936. And you can see the British police repressing the strike. Turned into a revolt, led, interestingly, by rural Palestinians and targeting the British, not the Jews, the British. Installations, anything that symbolized British power was attacked, railroads, trucks, and so on. And then the British responded, finally in 1938, with a massive influx of troops. If you haven't read or if you're interested in British imperial history, I really recommend Caroline Elkin's Legacy of Violence, which talks a little bit about how tactics of repression honed in Ireland and India were perfected in Palestine in the late 1930s. So what I want to say, kind of rushing toward a conclusion here, is that yes, there are two groups of people, mutually exclusive, fearful for their own, why am I doing this? I don't know, existence, but we must pay attention to the third party involved. All right? It was the British who organized the Palestine Mandate, organized it in such a way against the recommendations of their very own advisors, including General Allenby, right? So that political power belonged only to the small minority of Jews in the 1920s, and the vast majority of Arabs were left out of government. The Balfour Declaration did not grant political rights to Arabs, civil and religious rights only, all right? Charles Tilly, in his book on the politics of collective violence, argues that in countries with the greatest asymmetry in political power, countries where the government is unable to control violence in the society. Everybody owned a gun in Palestine, right? You see the greatest violence, and you see what he calls a kind of institutionalization, or let me see what his term is, the coordinated destruction is the term he uses, of organized endemic violence inside a society. So you have the Jewish paramilitary groups, you have the Arab paramilitary groups. They see themselves as zero-sum. Silenced in that process were those who still argued, and the many who still argued for some form of more egalitarian coexistence, okay? There were Jews who argued for equal representation in the government in the 1920s. They are silenced by the labor Zionists and the Jabotinskys, all right? On the Arab side, there were people, we saw them, seeking through diplomacy. They were laughed at. They were made ridiculed for believing even in diplomacy and international law. And they gave way to those who would carry guns. It was the British who intentionally constructed this regime, and here I'll just end with a quote. Lord Balfour himself, you're seen here, he is the chair of the League of Nations Council that ratified the Palestine Mandate, including the Balfour Declaration in 1922, and he defended it against particularly Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon was his sort of peer in British government, former Viceroy of India, and so on, who said, you cannot establish a Palestine mandate that erases Palestinian Arabs. It just, this is not going to work. And he said, quote, our justification for our policy is that we regard Palestine as being absolutely exceptional, that we consider the question of the Jews outside Palestine as one of world importance. And by contrast, the Arabs were of no importance. Okay, so Palestine was constructed as an exception to the supposed regime of international law created coming out of World War I, built on the fears born of the wars, violence in World War I, built on the violence against law and democracy by the Paris Peace Conference, and built on the asymmetries of power institutionalized by the British in the mandate. Thank you. Appreciate it. How do I turn that off? Sorry for going on too long.
For the recording, I need to use this microphone. We have a little bit of time left. Yes, we do have 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes left for Q&A. But before we start that, I wanted to remind you, there's a feedback form that was left on the chairs.
Yeah.
So if you would like to, please fill that out before you leave. Or if you prefer, there is this code that you can scan and fill it out there. But we would appreciate this feedback. So the floor is now open to questions, starting with preferably with students. If there are any students with questions, the priority is yours. Students seem to be a little shy at the moment, but I see a hand there. Yes. Do you want to?
Given the description of the British mandate, is this working? Okay, that you gave, I just have a question about who ran things there. Was there any kind of representative assembly that the British had, or who ran things?
In the British mandate?
In the mandate, yes.
Oh, thank you. Great question. Other mandates were very slowly adopted constitutions and incorporated, constructed parliaments, albeit in Lebanon and Syria, under the heavy thumb of a high commissioner, right? There was no government of that sort, no representative government. At the beginning of the 20s, the first high commissioner in the mandate tried to negotiate, but the Arabs boycotted because they said, we want one man, one vote. And they were not being offered elective posts. There was going to be a little council where the High Commissioner would appoint people, and there'd be more Jews than Arabs. And they said, hey, wait a second, 90% of the population, 10% of the population, why are we getting fewer seats? And so they just boycotted it. And eventually the British, by the 1930s, gave up on the idea that there could be a unitary government. So insofar as policing occurred, the British controlled Palestine to a greater or lesser degree. You saw with the revolt, it took a little while for them to move the troops in to shut it down. But the Yishuv became a state within itself and ran itself autonomously from the Arab side. The British did appoint, interestingly, as the supreme representative, the one guy who could get an appointment with the High Commissioner, a mufti, as the representative of the Palestinians, much to the horror of Palestinian Christians and much to the horror of the many secularists who had been up in that Congress in Damascus. And even the mufti despaired by the early 1930s of getting any kind of a fair voice in policymaking, if you will.
Thank you so much for this talk. I have two questions. You mentioned briefly that starting from the 20s, the Jewish minority in Palestine had more political power. Can you explain in what ways, or what was the discriminatory policy that allowed for them to have more power? The second question is about the fact that the British favored the Zionist cause. Can you explain why or for what reasons?
Oh, wow. Yeah. The whole book's written on this, and I know I compressed a lot, even so I went on a little longer than I'd hoped. Two things. The thing that Arabs admittedly most wanted to do was to gain representation in a government so they could limit immigration. It was an open secret that Ben-Gurion planned to bring in immigrants and create a Jewish majority, all right, over time. It would take several decades, but hey, steady as we go. Jabotinsky disagreed, right? He said, no, let's just pick up guns and take the territory. There was an advantage in terms of the immigration, first of all. Second, in the amount of money coming from outside to support those people who emigrated to Palestine was not money. You know, Herbert Hoover was sent by Wilson first to bring food to the Belgians, you know, not to the Germans who were starving under the Allied blockade, but ultimately to the Russians, right? The American policy during the Russian Civil War was, let's feed the people and then they won't be so interested in Bolshevism anymore, right? But aid was not sent to the Middle East. I mean, it wasn't just people in Greater Syria who were destitute for years. I mean, the agricultural production overall in Greater Syria did not return to 1914 levels until about 1930, and then the World Depression hit, okay? However, with infrastructure, you know, there were concessions granted to Jews for electrical systems, telephone systems, and so on, that Arabs were not eligible for. Mostly, I think it was the relative deprivation. To their credit or not, labor Zionists did not want to hire Arabs as cheap labor, right? They did not, although they relied on colonial contacts to get the Balfour Declaration and so on, they did not think of themselves as colonizers. They did not want to replicate what settler colonists did in places like Algeria or South Africa and so on. But what they also wanted was a clear, homogeneous community, all right, that they were told in this era that stability and prosperity belongs to homogeneous nation states, right? The problem was that what if you were a minority in a new nation state? It's one thing to be among many different ethnicities in an Ottoman Empire or an Austro-Hungarian Empire, but to be a Jewish minority in Poland, right, where the name of the country is Poland, and by definition you were Jewish and not Polish, right, was a death sentence to them. They did not want to become a minority in a Greater Syria, despite what promises there might have been that they would get equal rights from Damascus or so on. They would still be a minority. So they were building a very separate economy. Their investments in Palestine, although they at first promised that this would lift all boats and everyone would benefit, in fact, Arabs were not getting many benefits, so that there were, I had intended a contrasting picture of Arab Jaffa to you saw very modern looking Tel Aviv as a way of trying to explain to you what Arabs recognized as their growing disadvantage in the mandate. Does that help to?
The other question about why the British favored the Zionists.
Oh, there's a good book by Jonathan Schneer on the Balfour Declaration, which I would highly recommend because he goes very carefully into the negotiations the Chaim Weizmann undertook with the British cabinet. Many different reasons. Another good book is Tom Segev, One Palestine Complete. Long story short, there were many British who were anti-Semites, and they believed that there was a Jewish conspiracy in the world, and that if we pleased Chaim Weizmann, maybe Russia would stay in the war. This is 1917. Russian Revolution hadn't quite happened yet. And Jews control the Russian Revolution. Jews in America control America, and we want America to come into the war. So that's all spelled out. There were others, briefly, on the military side who said, oh, wouldn't that be nice to have a Palestine to help protect the Suez Canal, right? Interestingly, though, by the mid-1920s, the military had, in fact, reversed its thinking on Palestine. It was a liability. It was not a boon to the security of the British Empire at all. It comes down to, according to these scholars, in many ways, the fact that Balfour was close friends with Chaim Weizmann, who had a chemist who had contributed to the war effort. Balfour was a man who was known as a completely unprincipled guy, right? And why he picked on this project is still up to debate, but it became his one passion. And he was able to, despite everything that Wilson and all those who had hoped to restructure international affairs at the end of World War I, the old guard, the old imperial guard held sway. Another very good book is by Elizabeth Peterson. It's called The Guardians, and it shows you how the League of Nations, the embodiment of Wilson's vision of a world run by law, right, set up in Geneva, was hijacked by colonial interests. Every country sent their colonial ministers and members of their colonial staffs to represent them in the League of Nations. And so when it came to ratifying a mandate that Lord Curzon, an experienced colonial administrator, called a travesty, there was Balfour right there, able to use the system for his own purposes.
I'm having a little, can you hear me? Okay. I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding this whole colonization process that occurred with with the British. Was it, and I liked his question, was it to make room for the Jewish population that was coming over? Or would this had happened had there not been a migration of Jewish people to Palestine? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Back up a little bit. In 1916, there was a purely colonial document called the Sykes-Picot Accord, in which, roughly speaking, not exactly these boundaries that you saw on the mandates, but the French would get the northern part of Syria and a little bit of what is now Turkey and a little bit of what is now Iraq, and Britain would get the southern part of Syria, right? They projected at that time that they would have direct control over the coast, but there would be a kind of indirect rule with a local ruler on the interior, except for Palestine. They couldn't agree on Palestine, and they designated in 1916 as an international zone. Also party to that accord was Russia, which was going to get control of Constantinople and the Straits, right? Russia falls out of the war. There are those who argued Sykes-Picot was invalidated once you lost Russia as your key signer of the accord. And the British, that's why I featured Allenby in the beginning, they captured the Holy Land at a time when they were losing battles in Europe, and they didn't want to let go. Lloyd George's own granddaughter, Margaret Macmillan, who wrote a book called Paris 1919, characterized him as a liberal become land grabber. And the crux of the problem was that the British wanted to keep not only Palestine as a Christmas present, but they also wanted oil in northern Iraq. What is northern Iraq today? In territory that they'd previously promised the French. And the French said, "You've got to be kidding. We were allies in this war. Yeah, we held down the Western Front while you held down the Ottoman front, but we're cooperating. You can't now turn the tables and say, oh, you're the conquering power and you get it all in the Middle East." And so the British felt, well, we have to give Syria over to the French if we want to keep Palestine and the oil regions of Iraq, right? And so up until recently, this period has been written about in books with titles like The Climax of French Imperialism, right? World War I was an imperialist war, and the Allied imperialists were all in it to gain territory, right? The British and French recruited the Italians and the Greeks into the Allied side with promises of territory in your homeland of Turkey, right? Then latecomer Woodrow Wilson comes along and says, oh, no. We're not going to enter this war in 1917 to the benefit of colonial empires. I can't sell that to my population, so I'm going to announce in Article 5 that this war will result in an adjustment of all these colonial claims and the right consent of the governed. So does that help a little bit?
Thank you.
Sure.
We can probably take another question. Yes, Haza.
Thank you. Thank you for this very exciting talk. I have a question about population and migration. So you said that Greater Syria was not really populated, and I assume it was also due to transatlantic migrations of the late 19th century. And I was thinking about whether transatlantic Syrians and Palestinians also involved in the peacemaking processes or drafting the constitution, or I was wondering if in the 1920s political leaders in these regions called for their transatlantic migrants. Was there return migration due to that reason? They might think that, we need more population, we need our Syrians and Palestinians back.
You mean,
So
did they feel that it was unpopulated?
Not really unpopulated, but maybe since Jews were migrating, Syrian or Palestinian leaders were also searching, they wanted the transatlantic migrants back. So
I wanted what back? I'm sorry. I'm going to get closer because I can't hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There were the American Syrians and Palestinians. So I was wondering if did you come across anything saying that political leaders based in the regions like calling for like migrants back? Like who created the flag?
Okay, got it. Yes, good book by Stacey Farenthold on this. Yeah, okay, you know her book. So yes, definitely, there was a sense that maybe they could come back because it would be better governed, right? And they could make a living. So many people, they were first or second generation migrants to the Americas, for example, contemplated coming back. World War I was the era in which the modern passport really took hold, and it was not hard to block that reverse migration. The flip side of that was that definitely Zionists argued there's plenty of room for immigrants in Palestine, and no problem bringing in the immigrants from Europe, right? Arabs, of course, pushed back on that idea. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Libby. But please join me.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
yourself. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.